Welcome back. Act 2 of this play picks up with following the exploits of Talbot. And we get a few scenes that serve to show that he isn't just a brute warrior, he's not just some beast. Although, one could be forgiven for thinking so from the descriptions that we get of him from last week's readings. But now, we find out that he's cunning as well as ferocious, which serves to make him a more well-rounded character, as well as a more dangerous enemy to the French. The first thing that we read about is that he recaptures Orleans with the Dukes of Bedford and Burgundy. They drive out the French nobility, who all immediately start accusing each other for the sudden reversal of fortunes, as the French are going to do in this play, because they're always depicted poorly. But then, while Talbot's celebrating, he gets a message from a French noble lady, the Countess of Overton. And she says that she wants him to go visit her in her castle so that she can behold with her own eyes the great soldier that all the country's talking about. Now, even someone with lesser wits would probably suspect that something's up here. Why would an enemy invite you over to their house just so that they can admire you? But Talbot, remember, is sort of the last representative of chivalry left. And when a woman, a noble woman, makes such a polite request of you, I guess the only chivalrous thing to do is to accept it. And of course, it's probably a very flattering invitation as well. Not every soldier gets to hear that a countess is in awe of him. So we could probably forgive a soldier for being, a bit overawed and rushing to her castle, too sure of himself and not thinking very clearly. But Talbot doesn't do that. He has a plan, although we aren't made privy to it until it's executed. He gets to the Countess's castle, and the first thing that she does, strangely enough, is insult him. And when he turns to leave, she says, "Not so fast. You're my prisoner." So her plan has been treachery all along. Even though there are hints, I think, that she does truly admire Talbot, even if she fears him and despises him as the enemy of France at the same time. Those hints, she makes the comment that his shadow has been her prisoner for a long time already. And by that, she means a portrait of him that's been hanging up in her gallery. And now, just like the shadow or the portrait, she's trapped him, the real thing, in the castle as well. But, one might ask, reasonably, why does she have his portrait hanging up in the gallery in the first place? It's kind of a weird thing to do for someone who you are saying that you feel only disgust for. And I think that what this points to instead is that this countess is enamored of Talbot in spite of her commitment to her country. She's meditated on his portrait, listened to reports of his battles, breathless with rapture and excitement, and she views her capture of him as a conquest to be truly proud of. But this, alas for her, isn't to be. Talbot just scoffs, and he says, "You still have nothing but my shadow to be captor over. You might think that because you have just me, you've got the whole Lord Talbot, but that's not so." And then this exchange between the two of them takes place. Talbot says, No, I am but shadow of myself. You are deceived, my substance is not here, for what you see is but the smallest part and least proportion of humanity. I tell you, madam, were the whole frame here, it is of such a spacious, lofty pitch, your roof were not sufficient to contain it. And the Countess responds, This is a riddling merchant for the nonce. He will be here, and yet he is not here. How can these contrarieties agree? And Talbot responds, That will I show you presently. Then the stage directions say that he winds his horn, drums strike up, there's a peal of ordnance, and soldiers enter. And Talbot continues, How say you, madam? Are you now persuaded that Talbot is but the shadow of himself? These are his substance, sinews, arms, and strength, with which he yoketh your rebellious necks, razeth your cities and subverts your towns, and in a moment makes them desolate. So he's saying that I'm not really my full strength until my soldiers are behind my back. That's my whole body. And I think that this is an interesting description of the leader of an army. He's saying that he and his army are one, that he's larger than himself. And he's saying it in terms that really I think are similar to the way that the Apostle Paul describes the body of Christ in the New Testament. He says in the book of Corinthians that we are all of the same body, and we all contribute to the whole, the way that the individual parts of the human body contribute to the whole of our individual bodies. And Christ himself says that he dwells in us just as surely as we dwell in him. So Talbot feels so at one with his army, so connected, that he doesn't feel whole without them. Well, after this, the Countess admits that she's been outmatched and, giving another sign of her admiration for him, invites them all to stay for dinner. So here Talbot proves that he can achieve victory through wit as well as through strength. So at this point, the play, it seems to skip forward pretty abruptly. Remember, it has to cover the span of about 30 years here. When we meet King Henry, he's already a young man. And the next time that we see Bedford, Prince John, he's gone from being a warrior who can scale a fortress wall to an old graybeard who has to be carried about on a litter on the outskirts of the battlefield and kind of give commands sitting down. But we're suddenly landed in the midst of a court of law in London, and now we're introduced to more squabbling nobles and more factions. So there's apparently been a dispute about a man named Richard Plantagenet's inheritance. And he's trying to claim the title of the Duke of York. Why he's doing this, we'll talk about in a minute. And another noble, Somerset, is saying that he is actually barred from inheriting the title and its properties because his father, the Earl of Cambridge, was executed for treason. Somerset is saying that because the father forfeited his titles and rights along with his life, then the son has no right to claim them as well. Well, their argument gets heated, and at one point, Richard says to all of the others standing around them, "Okay, enough talking. Everyone choose which one of us is in the right and which one of us is in the wrong." And because they're standing in a garden while they're having this argument, he plucks a white rose from off a nearby shrub. And he says, "Whoever thinks that my argument is right, pick a white rose and wear it in your lapel." And Somerset, enraged at this, plucks a red rose and makes the same declaration to his followers. Both men are persuasive and well-liked, and so they each get a good number of the surrounding nobles to pledge themselves to their own side. Now, since you know that these plays are leading up to a conflict called the War of the Roses, the significance of this moment probably hasn't escaped you. Here, we see the battle lines already being drawn, although how this particular dispute is related to Henry VI isn't made known until the next scene. So, Richard Plantagenet goes to the Tower of London at the request of an old, long-confined prisoner on his deathbed. Who is this prisoner? Well, it turns out that it's none other than Edmund Mortimer from Henry IV Part 1. You'll remember that the leaders of that previous rebellion were all eventually executed. Hotspur, Northumberland, the Archbishop, but not Mortimer. We didn't really find out what happened to Mortimer until now. He's apparently been kept in the Tower of London as a prisoner for decades. And we don't get to find out what happened to his Welsh wife who couldn't speak English either, which is unfortunate because, we just want to know, maybe. So, Richard goes to visit Mortimer, and he calls Mortimer his uncle, which probably comes as a surprise, because we've been following the adventures of the royal family all this time, and we never knew that Mortimer was the uncle to anybody. So, who is this Richard Plantagenet? This is really important to understanding the conflict that breaks out later. And also because he's at least distantly related to a lot of people who we've already met. So, Mortimer claims that Richard is his nephew. And you can see on the family tree how this is so. Mortimer had a sister, Anne, who ended up marrying the son of the old Duke of York from our first play, Richard II. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, the Duke of York's only son was O'Merle. There was a whole scene where his wife was pleading with him not to reveal O'Merle's treachery because he would probably be killed, and he was the only son that they had. Shakespeare made a point of it in Richard II to say that he was the Duke of York's only son. So, who's this other son that we're just now finding out about? Well, there's two answers to this. One is that Shakespeare made a mistake when he was writing that scene back in the other play. He conveniently forgot about the second son, whose name was also Richard, in order to achieve the melodramatic effect that he wanted when the Duke of York was considering turning in O'Merle for treason. That's one explanation, but apparently the historical Duke of York did his best to forget about his second son as well. He makes no mention of him in his will. He left him no lands, and so it's speculated that maybe this was an illegitimate child, although we'll never know for sure. In any case, we've already met this mysterious second son, Richard. He is the Earl of Cambridge from before. He was one of the 3 nobles who conspired with the French to assassinate Henry V back in the last play. And if you remember back to then, Henry was astonished that such close friends, such respected lords, would sell their king out for the mere promise of gold. And it did seem like something of a paltry prize for taking on so great a risk. Well, now a motive is revealed that the Earl of Cambridge didn't reveal in the last play. He wasn't just conspiring against Henry V for the French's money. He had this grievance against him, that technically he should be sitting on the English throne. His mother is the daughter of Edward III's 3rd son, while Henry V was a descendant of Edward III's 4th son. So, according to the order of succession, the crown should be his. And this is actually the same complaint that Edmund Mortimer made back in the Henry IV plays. And he actually alludes to those plays in the conversation that he has with Richard Plantagenet here. And the way that this reads makes it seem like Richard didn't know any of this until his conversation with his dying uncle. He was only out to get the title of the Duke of York rightfully bestowed on him. But now, he realizes, he's owed more than just some measly dukedom. He's owed the kingdom. So, after revealing this genealogy, Edmund Mortimer succumbs to his old age and he dies. But of course, he's managed to sow the seeds for a future civil war in order to keep the cycle going after his own civil war a few decades earlier failed. So that's nice. And now we have the faction of the White Rose and the faction of the Red Rose. And because England has dissolved at this point into a mob of squabbling nobles, they both become entwined in the 2 other factions that have already been established, Gloucesters and Winchesters. So as the years have passed, their hatred of each other has only grown. And because Somerset is on Winchester's side, because Winchester is his uncle, the White Rose faction, almost as a matter of course, just to be contrary, takes Gloucester's side. Richard Plantagenet himself doesn't say much, because he's showing signs of the same shrewdness that Henry Bolingbroke possessed. He knows that it's not his place right now, titleless as he is, to argue with noblemen the likes of Gloucester and Winchester. But the Earl of Warwick, who is on his side, sort of voices his opinions for him, and berates Winchester and Somerset when they're all meeting together. Well, things have now heated up to the point of chaos. Winchester and Gloucester's supporters are fighting each other in the streets. The mayor of London once again comes begging for them to make peace because nobody feels safe. And yeah, it's almost got the mood of a modern-day big city that's being overrun with rival gangs. There's senseless violence, and all the shops and homes are boarded up because nobody knows when the next fight's going to break out. This time, King Henry adds his pleas to those of the mayors for there to be peace. He's still young, and we get the impression when he meets with the nobles that he's legitimately pleading with them to make peace, as opposed to commanding them to, like a good monarch should. Which is an important point of difference that's going to become a problem for him later. But for now, however, he gets them to set aside their differences and shake hands. Although while they're doing so, Winchester murmurs under his breath that he still won't let the grudge go, and he means to get revenge. And there's a lot of murmuring going on here. Another person that murmurs under his breath is Somerset, because King Henry, during the same meeting, grants Richard his request and makes him the new Duke of York. So peace is momentarily kept, not because Henry is in control, but because everyone involved in the quarrel just decides to wait for a more opportune time to push their point forward. And one of the nobles realizes this. The Duke of Exeter says, as everyone is leaving, that this late dissension grown betwixt the peers burns under feigned ashes of forged love, and will at last break out into a flame. As festered members rot but by degree, till bones and flesh and sinews fall away, so will this base and envious discord breed. And now I fear that fatal prophecy, which in the time of Henry named the Fifth, was in the mouth of every sucking babe, that Henry born at Monmouth should win all, and Henry born at Windsor lose all. Which is so plain that Exeter doth wish his days may finish ere that hapless time. So, this is a complete mess, a powder keg waiting to explode. And the war in France isn't going as splendidly as one could hope either. King Henry is on his way there now that he's old enough, and he's going there to be crowned king in Paris officially. But this is largely ceremonial, since the Dauphin still controls so much of the French territory, and that the majority of the French still view him as their rightful king. So Joan and the French nobles attempt to liberate the city of Rouen from the English, but they fail to do so. Talbot, with again the help of Bedford and Burgundy, manages to hold on to the city despite the cowardice and the treachery amongst his own ranks. But then the English fortunes turn. Bedford, who, as I said earlier, is now stricken with age, dies. From his litter, he sees the Dauphin and Joan fleeing from Rouen, and comments that he can now die contented because he's seen his enemy defeated. But this is the beginning of all sorts of trouble. Bedford, we know, was an able military commander. He was brave in battle, and he was also shrewd in strategy, such as when he tricked the rebels into sending their army home back in Henry IV Part 2. And without his military knowledge and his experience, Talbot's courage alone isn't enough to hold the army together. The Duke of Burgundy deserts to the French almost immediately after Bedford's death. As I've mentioned before, he was only really on the English side because of his personal respect for Bedford, although Shakespeare doesn't mention this factor. Instead, Shakespeare attributes his desertion to Joan's rhetorical skills. She hails him over as the armies are passing by each other, and she reprimands him for shedding his own countrymen's blood and wounding his own homeland. And it doesn't seem like it takes much to convince him to switch sides. And this is probably, again, Shakespeare taking another jab at the French. He has Joan herself marvel at how easily she's beguiled Burgundy, and she comments that he behaved exactly like a Frenchman would behave, by turning and turning again. So, next week, we'll see these two separate threads that this play has been following. The factions in London and the war in France. We'll see them come together in the last two acts. So, for next time, read both Acts 4 and Act 5, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.